Hello, and welcome to this online information session on the consultation on the restriction proposal of lead in outdoor shooting and fishing. My name is Mark Blaney, and I'm going to take you through the first parts of the presentation today. And then my colleagues, Christian and Peter, who you can see on the screen in front of you, will take you through the next parts. And then I will finish off with the last part of the presentation. So what can you expect from today's information session? Well, you can learn about the REACH restriction process. We can tell you some details of the proposed restriction on the use of lead in outdoor shooting and in fishing sinkers and lures. You can learn about the consultation process and how you can submit information. And hopefully this will help you decide if and what information to submit. And then you can get some answers to your questions if you have any following the information session. So this is what today's program looks like. First of all, I give you an introduction to the information session and to the REACH restriction process. Then my colleague Christian will give you more details on the proposed restriction. Then Peter will take you through how to participate in the consultation. And then I'll give you some concluding remarks and tell you about the next steps. Then following the information session, there'll be an opportunity between 12 and 1 for you to answer questions or to ask questions and to get answers on those questions. So once we reach that stage, how do you send us your questions? Well, we use Slido. So you need to go to slido.com. Then you type in the event code #LED, or you can pause the video if you like and scan the QR code, which you can see below on the screen with your phone. Of course, we cannot necessarily answer all questions today. So if your question is not answered, please feel free to contact us at the form address you can see below, echa.europa.eu/contact. Then once the online information session is finished, we will publish the material on our website. That includes the video recording, the presentations, and the questions and answers that we will produce. And you can find that at the address you see on the screen. So now I will give you an introduction to the REACH restriction process and specifically on the consultation on the restriction proposal of lead in outdoor shooting and fishing. So, REACH restrictions. They're there to protect your health and the environment from the risks posed by chemicals. It addresses risks that are not adequately controlled, where action is required at the union level, and it's a safety net for other REACH and EU processes. Restrictions normally limit or ban the manufacture, placing on the market, or use of a substance. And this substance can also be one that appears in a mixture or in an article. However, restrictions can also set out specific conditions, such as technical measures or labeling requirements. And a restriction can be proposed either by a member state or, as in this case, by ECHA. So what does a restriction proposal look like? Well, this is done in a specific format, and this is what we call the Annex 15 report. And this contains information on the hazards and exposures and risk from the substances which are addressed. It contains a justification why action is needed at an EU-wide level and gives available information on alternatives that can be used instead of the substance targeted. Then the restriction proposal also has to give an assessment to show that the restriction is the most appropriate risk management measure to address the risk that's been identified. And it can also include a socioeconomic impact analysis. And in most cases, this is done. And this whole package is then looked at by the committees, but it will inform the final decision makers, who are the Commission or member states, of information to make their decision. So I mentioned the restriction process. So at the moment, we are in the middle part of the process. We have already prepared and submitted the restriction proposal, and now we are on the consultation and opinion development stage. Then after this, we have the decision and follow-up stage, which, as I mentioned, is where the Commission with member states make the decision on the restriction. So let's look at these middle stages in a bit more detail. So we have two consultations on the proposal. First is the consultation on the Annex 15 report itself, and this is open for 6 months. And then later in the process, we have a consultation on one of the opinions of the committees, the Socioeconomic Analysis Committee, where once they have made their draft opinion, this is then consulted on for 60 days. And while this is ongoing, we are also in the committees developing the opinion on the proposal. So this is three parts. Firstly, advice from the forum on enforceability, then the opinion of the risk assessment committee, and then the opinion of the socioeconomic analysis committee. So as I said, after submission, the report is evaluated by the two ECHA scientific committees, and they look at the effectiveness of a proposed restriction. So the restriction must be targeted to the effects or exposures resulting in the risk, and it must be capable of reducing these risks within a reasonable time period, and also be proportionate to the risk. The socioeconomic analysis on the proposal looks at the net benefits, and that's benefits to human health and the environment, and the costs to manufacturers, importers, consumers, and others. And then the opinions bring all of this together to also enable the decision makers to decide on the restriction. So this is the timeline after submission. The restriction dossier is publicly available shortly after submission, and you probably would have already have seen that. However, we would like to stress that this version is not to be used for the consultation because it may have been updated before the opinion making properly starts. Then we have the opinion making process, which typically lasts for 14 months. We first have the conformity check, and in case of the restriction on outdoor shooting and fishing, this has already taken place and the committees have found it to be in conformity. Then we have the first consultation, as I mentioned, lasting 6 months, and this will end on the 24th of September 2021. The evaluation of the proposal is then undertaken by the two committees and sets out in an opinion. And then, as I mentioned, also there is the consultation on the SEAC draft opinion later in the process. Once all this has been done, the opinions are combined, published, and sent to the European Commission for the decision. And then to say that, lastly, the comments that are submitted in any of the consultations and the responses we will also publish. And these responses are from both the dossier submitter, in this case ECHA, and the rapporteurs of the Risk Assessment Committee and the Socioeconomic Analysis Committee. So a little bit more about the evaluation in the committees. As you can see in front of you, there are some elements that are looked at certain parts of the process. So in the first committee meeting, the first plenary meeting, The Risk Assessment Committee looks at the scope, tries to conclude on the hazard, and looks in a preliminary way at exposure and risk. In the Socioeconomic Analysis Committee, again, they look at the scope and try to conclude on the costs. In the second plenary, RAC tries to conclude on the exposure and risk and starts to look at things like the derogations and the other technical parts of the restriction proposal, whereas SEAC tries to conclude on the benefits, holds preliminary discussions on proportionality to the risk, and also looks at the derogations. Then in the third committee meeting, RAC tries to finalise the derogations and needs to finalise the opinion at this stage because this is the deadline for adopting the final opinion. In SEAC, they try to conclude on proportionality and derogations and finalise the opinion and agree the draft opinion. And this is the stage where the consultation on the SEAC draft opinion occurs. This is after it's been agreed in plenary 3. Then there is a fourth plenary for SEAC where they conclude on issues raised during the SEAC draft opinion and then adopt the final opinion.
Hello, my name is Christian Lochmeijer, and in this presentation I'd like to talk you through the restriction proposal of lead in outdoor shooting and fishing. In this presentation, I'd like to discuss about why are we putting forward this proposal, the scope of the proposal and the risks that we have identified, the restriction proposal itself, highlights for each sector, and as well as the conclusions. But first, why are we putting forward this proposal? First and foremost, this proposal is about lead. The EU and ECHA, we are concerned about the toxicity of lead. Lead has been phased out in petrol, in paints, ceramics, electric devices, and other uses. Lead is restricted on the REACH for the following uses: jewelry, consumer articles, and gunshot in and over wetlands. With this proposal, we do not seek to stop hunting, shooting, or fishing. We are seeking to protect people and the environment from the toxicity of lead. There have been other EU measures concerning lead. And in a paper, this is mapped over time against the blood lead levels measured in a group of students. And what you can see is a correlation between these measures and the blood lead levels. This is what we are after, a further reduction of lead and its toxicity and its exposure to human health and the environment. Let me talk you through the scope of the proposals and the risks that we have identified. What is in scope are outdoor activities. Activities such as hunting, shooting, for sports and for other purposes, and for fishing. Indoor activities, indoor uses of lead and lead in sport shooting are out of scope. The proposal focuses on gunshot, on air pellets, and on bullets, on projectiles. The other ammunition parts, such as primers, propellants, cartridge cases, are out of scope of this proposal. The focus is on civilian use, military uses, and uses for police and law enforcement, security protection, forensic uses, etc. are out of scope. There's a full list in the restriction proposal in the Annex 15 report. The proposal focuses as well on fishing sinkers and lures of all weights and all dimensions, regardless of whether you've bought them in a shop, over the web, or whether you've made them at home yourself through home casting. Within this broad description of lead in hunting, sport shooting, and ammunition, we have identified uses each with a different potential for substitution. We've also estimated the releases associated with those uses. You can see that here outlined in the table which is on the screen. It is those releases of lead that result into effects into the environment and human health. So the release of lead into the environment leads to risks for the environment. It leads to risks for birds and for other species. Birds mistake lead shot, lead sinkers and lures for grit that they pick up in order to ingest their food. Birds also pick up contaminated soil. And in this way, birds suffer from lead poisoning. Birds that contain lead in this manner also form a source of lead poisoning for raptors that prey on these birds. Hunters that use lead and shoot animals with lead leave contaminated carrion in the environment, which also forms a source of lead for raptors and vultures. Ruminants that eat contaminated silage and grass also are exposed to lead. In our report, we have estimated that about 135 million of birds are at risk every year. Lead also contaminates water and soil. There is pollution of water and soil from the deposition of lead ammunition in the soil of shooting ranges. Lead is also toxic for humans. The effects are well known. Lead mimics calcium even at low exposure. And the result of that is that adults can suffer from chronic kidney disease or increased blood pressure. For young children, it results into damage to the brain and the nervous system. It has an impact on learning and it has an impact on behavioral problems. And this is measured as reduced IQ points. Exposure to lead happens during the critical phase of the nervous system development, either via the transfer of lead from the mother to the fetus in uterus, or via the transfer of lead via breast milk. There's a high lead intake during growth, when children also have a high demand for calcium. This leads to risks to human health. Hunters and shooters and fishers are exposed to lead from shooting and or from handling lead. There's also exposure from home casting, for example when fishers make their own fishing tackle. Humans are also exposed via the environment. When they consume game meat, there's a risk for children. We have demonstrated an IQ point loss based on ECHA data on game meat consumption and measured concentration of lead in game meat. There's an intake of water and food that's contaminated by lead in and around shooting ranges. Let me talk you through the restriction proposal. The main elements of the restriction proposal are the following. We consider a ban on placing on the market or use with transition periods for uses with widespread lead releases to the environment and where alternatives are available. We consider derogated uses. Uses are allowed to continue, with some continued use of lead ammunition allowed if the risks are minimized, such as, for example, the mandatory use of bullet traps. In all elements, we consider that the consumers should be informed about the risks of using lead. It's done either at the point of sale or through labeling. That is for the derogated uses and during a transition period. This is with the aim to improve consumer awareness. We propose a system for mandatory reporting by the EU member states for the use of gunshot, if derogation for sport shooting with gunshot is preferred to a ban. Let's look at what we propose for hunting and for bullets. We considered in our report that alternatives are available for most forms of hunting. when it concerns large calibers, there's a wide variety of bullet weights and types that are available for bullets larger than 5.6 mm. This concerns, for example, the .222 and the .223 calibers. Based on field studies and information from manufacturers, we have understood that these alternatives are suitable and effective. We propose therefore a ban on the use with a transition period of 18 months. For small caliber ammunition, alternatives are available, but they are currently limited in their availability and they are not widely tested. This relates, for example, to the .22 long rifle caliber. Here we propose a ban on the use with a longer transition period of 5 years. We've also understood, based on stakeholder information, that for some forms of hunting, lead is difficult to replace. We therefore ask for more information on these uses from this consultation. When it comes to sport shooting with bullets, we've understood that alternatives are not yet widely available or approved, and that their precision is insufficient. The use of lead bullets for sport shooting is allowed, but only under strict conditions. The use needs to take place as a designated location for sport shooting, and shooting needs to take place under strict conditions with more than 90% of lead bullets recovered via bullet traps. We also propose a ban on agricultural use around shooting ranges. When it comes to hunting with gunshot, we take note that this is already restricted to a large extent under the proposal on the use of lead shot over wetlands. The Commission adopted the regulation on 25th of January 2021 covering the use of lead over wetlands. There are suitable alternatives available in the form of steel, bismuth or tungsten. We therefore propose a ban on placing on the market and use with a transition period of 5 years. When it comes to sport shooting with gunshot, such as for clay target shooting, we consider that suitable alternatives are available, mostly steel. There are similar restrictions in place in some of the EU member states. That leads us to consider that a ban on placing on the market and use is the most suitable option for gunshot, both for hunting and for sport shooting. However, the Olympic rules set by the International Sport Shooting Federation require lead shot for skeet and trap. It is with that in mind that we are also considering an optional derogation under strict conditions with a transition period of 5 years. Those strict conditions are the following. The use needs to take place at the location which is approved by national authorities under strict conditions, regular collection of lead, and more than 90% of lead recovered. For sport shooting with gunshot, we have considered an optional derogation. And under that derogation, the continued use can take place under strict conditions. Use needs to take place at the location approved by national authorities under strict conditions. We require the regular collection of lead. More than 90% of lead needs to be recovered. Surface water needs to be contained, monitored, and when necessary, treated. Agricultural use around shooting ranges is banned. Lead gunshot for sport shooting should be sold by permitted retailers, and individual athletes can get permission from national authorities to use lead shot. There's also a labeling obligation stating clearly that the use of lead is associated with certain risks. And we also propose a reporting obligation from the member states to the EU Commission concerning this derogation. When it comes to fishing, we propose a ban on placing on the market and use of handmade and purchased sinkers and lures. we propose transition periods of 0, 3 or 5 years, depending on the type and the weight of the sinker, lure and of the practice of fishing. At all points, there should be information to consumers at the point of sale to raise awareness on the risks of lead. Let me talk you through another element of the proposed restriction, the information at the point of sale. Part of our proposal is that retailers of gunshot, other projectiles, fishing sinkers and lures that contain lead above 0.3% weight by weight or more should have the following information clearly and visibly given to consumers and professionals. Contains lead. Lead is very toxic to the environment and birds. Lead may damage fertility or the unborn child. The use of lead will be banned in the EU from, that would then be the date of entry. Lead-free alternatives are available. Of course, we understand that all this comes at a price. So for each of the uses that we have identified, we've estimated what would be the emission reduction over 20 years, the total costs, and the cost effectiveness. You can read more about this also in the report. That should be weighted against the benefits for society, the benefits of limiting the use of lead. This proposal would bring about a number of benefits for society. We would prevent human exposure to lead from home casting fishing sinkers and from eating contaminated cane meat, as well as limit human exposure to food and drinking water contaminated with lead. We would limit environmental lead exposure in wildlife habitats and avoid the risks of primary or secondary poisoning of animals. We would avoid the death and long-term effects of birds and other species. We've estimated that the mortality of about 1.2 million birds per year would be avoided. The monetized value of that is about 114 million. We would fulfill policy objectives under the EU Birds Directive, fulfill our commitments to the AY Agreement and to the CMS Raptors Memorandum of Understanding. They would overall be a positive impact on wildlife, ecosystem, and associated leisure activities. We've also estimated that the alternatives have overall a better environmental footprint than lead. Let me conclude with the following. We have identified risks at the EU level, risks to human health and the environment. Alternatives are suitable and available for several uses. Where we could find no suitable alternatives, where they're not available or whether there's another social impact, continued use is allowed if risks are minimized. We've proposed transition periods in order to allow sectors to adapt. I'd like to repeat once more again that this proposal does not seek to stop hunting, shooting, or fishing. This proposal aims to protect human health and the environment.
Hello everyone, my name's Peter Simpson and I'm the Restriction Process Coordinator here at ECHA. I'm now going to talk to you about how precisely you can participate in the consultation on this proposal to make sure that your views are well heard by the dossier submitter and also by the RAC and SAEC when they are evaluating the proposal. So the first slide, what to submit? Well, the first point here really is that it's any information that you would consider relevant for the committees, but also the dossier submitter to take into account during their evaluation. This can be based on your technical knowledge of the issue, based on your understanding of the proposal. So once you've read through the documents, if there is something specific that you want to feed back on, then of course you're very free to do this. How you can also submit information is by answering specific questions in the consultation, which are called specific information requests. And I'll show you where these appear on the website later on in the presentation. The specific information requests relate to topics that the Risk Assessment Committee, the Socioeconomic Analysis Committee, or ECHA as the dossier submitter, have identified as being particularly interesting, where they needed some additional information. In this particular consultation, we have a large number of specific information requests. There are 14, and they are split across 4 topic blocks. So there is a block on hunting, there is a block on sport shooting, a block on fishing, and then finally a block on what are called horizontal or non-specific issues, which relate to all aspects of the proposal. Now, before I move on to explaining each of these specific information requests to you, I want to make a point, a general point about submitting information to the consultation. As we've said, the committees are waiting to see your information and evaluate it, but they will only be able to make substantive comments on the proposal or to reflect on comments in their opinions if comments are made with supporting evidence. And the point that we make here is that a comment made without supporting evidence is unlikely really to significantly influence the opinion making or the proposal. And when we refer to supporting evidence, we mean things like technical reports, we mean justification with references to the scientific literature. It's essentially the source information that the members of the committees can go and check themselves, or the dossier submitter can check themselves to evaluate the basis upon which your comment has been grounded. What's interesting here and important to remember is that, and this relates, I think, more to the technical reports, where we talk about the performance of alternatives, for example, is that it's very possible to submit information to the consultation as confidential, as business sensitive information. And if a particular file is flagged as confidential, and this is possible to do on the web form, then that information will not be disseminated to the public domain, and it will be kept as confidential within the committees. There is a balance here, of course, when submitting information as confidential, is that it's more difficult to refer to it in the public versions of the opinions and in the public versions of the background documents. So where possible, information should be submitted publicly, but we recognise that in some cases information is business sensitive and then it will need to be submitted confidentially. So please do that where you need to. So now, moving to the first block of specific information requests on hunting. Questions 1 to 3 relate to hunting specific aspects of the proposal. Question 1 relates to alternatives to lead ammunition for rimfire calibers. The information in the proposal is that there's contradictory information on the accuracy of lead-free ammunition for rimfire calibers used for hunting. Therefore, the committees and the dossier submitter are interested in receiving additional information on this particular topic. 2 elements are being requested here. The first is to provide information on the accuracy of current lead-free ammunition for these rimfire calibers, and these can be in the form of bench tests, field reports, or any other similar investigation of the accuracy, again with supporting information. This is very important. And then the second part of this request relates to information on the potential future development of lead-free alternatives in these rimfire calibers. So whilst the current accuracy of these lead-free alternatives may not reach the required standards, please tell us about research and development and likely future developments of accuracy in these particular types of ammunition and the timelines for the commercialization of these technologies. Question 2 relates to alternatives to lead ammunition for certain types of hunting. And the committees and the dossier submitter are interested in 2 specific types of hunting. The first is for small game hunting with full metal jacket bullets. And we know that these are used for what's sometimes referred to as Nordic bird hunting. The specific information that is requested here is under what circumstances full metal jacket bullets are permitted in EEA, this is the European Economic Area countries, for hunting, and the availability and technical performance of lead-free alternatives for this type of hunting, the small game hunting with full metal jacket bullets. The second part of question 2 relates to hunting that takes place for the population management of seals. Here again, we're interested in under what circumstances does this type of hunting take place in EEA countries, and we're interested in the availability and technical performance of lead-free alternatives for this type of hunting. Question 3, the final question in the hunting block, relates to the differentiation between what are referred to as small and large caliber bullets. The caliber size threshold that's been used to differentiate between large calibers, which are proposed to have an 18-month transitional period for phase out, and small calibers that are proposed with a 5-year transitional period for phase out, is set at 5.6 millimeters. And this was set by the dossier submitter based on analysis of calibers allowed for hunting roe deer in different European hunting legislation. We know that the smallest tested alternatives are in the caliber range of 0.222 and 0.223, which is equivalent to 5.55 millimeters. What the committees and the dossier submitter are interested in here is whether or not the proposed cutoff value, this 5.6 millimeters, adequately reflects the differences in the suitability and availability of alternatives. For example, and to make this a bit more concrete, the question is asking, should the threshold be larger, 6 millimeters, or, for example, or should it be smaller? The opinion-making phase can be used to make these adjustments to the proposal to reflect the true performance of alternatives on the market. The second block of questions relates to sport shooting. Question 4, use of shooting ranges for agriculture. The information that is being requested for this specific question is on whether or not the use of shooting ranges or areas takes place for agricultural purposes. And this is, for example, including production of crops or other horticultural products for human or animal consumption. And this can either be when the range is being used or during periods where it's not being used, for example, in the autumn or winter months. As normal, and where possible, please can you tell us information in quantitative terms? So please can you provide quantitative information? And what we mean here specifically is if you're aware of within a particular region or a country, how many shooting ranges or areas there are, and what proportion of these are used for agricultural purposes for some or all of the year. A second part of this question relates to the existence of any specific concentration limits for lead in the soil at these sites, which would be used to control whether or not they can be used for agricultural purposes or not, a quality standard for soil. Question 5, this is to do with measures to do with risk management measures to limit the releases of lead to the environment at trap and skeet sport shooting ranges. There's 3 elements to this question. The first is again asking for quantitative information on what number or proportion of trap and skeet ranges in a particular area, for example, a country or a region of a country, have risk management measures that allow at least 90% of the spent lead gunshot to be collected on an annual basis. And there's a question within here asking how many stands are usually available at that range, which is asking really specifically about the size of these sorts of ranges that have the risk management measures in place. Part B of this question is asking that where these risk management measures are in place to achieve a 90% recovery, please can you tell us what they are? Because a number of different risk management measures have been proposed that could achieve this level, and it will be of interest to the rapporteurs to know which kind of risk management measures are actually being used in practice. Is it the walls? Is it the surface covering, for example, that are being used? And with this information, it will be highly interesting to have information on the costs of the different risk management measures to put in place. This would be the installation costs, but also any ongoing running costs for these risk management measures. And the final element of this question relates to the treatment and monitoring of surface water runoff from shooting ranges sites. And this is measures to monitor the lead concentration essentially in this surface water, and any measures that are put in place to reduce the lead concentration in this surface water runoff before it leaves the site. And this is technical information on the types of measures, and again, also the costs to implement and also their ongoing running costs. Question 6 is similar to question 5, but this relates to risk management measures that are used to limit the release of lead to the environment at outdoor rifle and pistol ranges. Similar format here to question 5. We're interested in quantitative information on the number or the proportion of outdoor rifle or pistol ranges in a particular country or region, wherever you have that information. What proportion or number of these ranges have bullet traps in place, and information on whether any other types of risk management measures are used in combination with bullet traps. The reason why the question on bullet traps is being asked is that these are the specific risk management measures that are being proposed that need to be in place to allow the continued use of lead bullets for sport shooting. Very specifically, bullet traps as risk management measures. And then the second part of this question, this is to understand the impacts of the proposal. If bullet traps are not used, which other risk management measures are already in place to limit the releases of lead to the environment? Question 7. So moving away from the environment now and focusing more on the shooters, the users of the ammunition themselves. What the committees and the dossier submitter are interested in here is information on the measures that could protect the health of these shooters. The first is on whether or not there are recommendations and measures that are implemented at outdoor shooting ranges to limit lead exposure to shooters. These can be examples in a particular area, or it can be mandatory measures that are implemented on a countrywide basis, but just the general experience of those risk management measures to protect the shooters from the lead fumes and dusts which are generated during the act of shooting. The second part of this question relates specifically on the monitoring of blood lead concentrations in sport shooters, and your experience on the recommendations and the use of blood lead monitoring to ensure that exposure of lead is aware. And the final question is data on lead exposure of sports shooters. This is a very specific information request and is likely to be very useful for the committee's evaluation. So if you have data available that you are able to share with us, please do this. As I mentioned before, it's possible to submit this on a confidential basis if necessary. Question number 8. This is about the remediation of shooting ranges or areas after the end of their operational lives. And the first part of this question asks the question about whether or not this remediation at the end of life is already foreseen by national legislation in a country or regional legislation. So whether or not this will automatically already take place. And if this is foreseen, who is responsible for the financing and for carrying out the remediation that takes place at the end of the operational life? And the final question is, how are the ongoing or the long-term risks from a contaminated shooting range site managed at the end of life if there's no remediation that takes place? And what the point is here is that if remediation is not done, are there potential ongoing issues around surface water runoff, for example, or groundwater contamination that could take place if there isn't an ongoing risk management at these sites? Any information that you have on these would be very interesting for the committees. So finally, question 9 on the sports shooting, and this is to do with the substitution of lead ammunition in outdoor sports shooting. The first part of the question relates to gunshot, and here the request from the committees is for information on whether or not there are proposals in Europe or elsewhere to phase out the use of lead ammunition in international sports shooting, and how long would be needed to implement this. The second part of question 9 relates to bullets, and again it picks up this issue on the performance, the accuracy of lead-free alternatives, and it points out that currently for sport shooting purposes the performance of lead-free ammunition is not acceptable. Please can you provide further information on the performance of lead-free ammunition in the form of bench tests or any other form of testing, as well as information on the development of lead-free alternatives in the future that may have acceptable performance. So when are these likely to be available? What sort of R&D is needed to develop such an alternative? The next block of specific information requests relate to fishing, and there are 2 questions. Question 10 relates to the practice of home casting of lead fishing sinkers and lures. And the question here is about some of the assumptions that have been made by the dossier submitter. So the dossier submitter is assuming that home casting is a popular activity among fishers, and that if a restriction only applied to placing on the market of lead-containing fishing tackle, but not its use, home casting would become more popular and these lead weights would remain being used for fishing activities and the risk would not be addressed. Therefore, that was the justification for including a restriction both on placing on the market, but also on the use of those articles on the riverbank, for example. So what this question is about is to provide information to allow ECHA's committees to evaluate these dossier submitter assumptions. And this could be information on the proportion of fishers that are making their own lead sinkers and lures, or information on the proportion of the comparison between the frequency that home cast lead fishing sinkers and lures are used compared to shop bought lead fishing sinkers and lures. Question 11 relates to alternatives to lead in fishing tackle, and please provide information on the availability of lead-free alternatives for the different types of lead fishing tackle which are proposed in this restriction with different transitional periods. And there are 3 specific types of lead fishing tackle which attract different phase-out periods in the proposal. And these are the sinkers and lures with a weight less than 50 grams, the sinkers and lures with a weight greater than 50 grams, and the lead wires. These different groups have different transitional periods, which reflects the understanding of the availability of alternatives in these different subgroups. So the committees and the dossier submitter are interested in any specific information on the availability of alternatives for these 3 specific groups. So finally, moving on to the horizontal issues. So question 12. This first question relates to the socioeconomic impacts of the proposed restriction. The proposal, the Annex 15 report, proposes a concentration limit of 1% by weight of lead. This cuts across all of the different uses assessed. The proposal also includes different transitional periods for different uses and sub-uses, and some of these are listed here. So for example, for hunting, there are different transitional periods proposed for use of lead gunshot compared to the use of lead in small caliber bullets compared to the use of lead in large caliber bullets. And some of the previous questions related to these different transitional periods. Equally for sport shooting, different transitional periods are proposed for gunshot and for bullets. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, for fishing tackle, there are different transitional periods for the different weights and also for the different practices. So where weights are intentionally released, there is a different transitional period from where those weights are intended to remain on the line. And moving on to the specific information request around 12, the committees and the dossier submitter are interested in any further information on the impacts of the proposed restriction. And the reason why the concentration limits and the transitional periods are important here to consider is that the committees are very interested in how the impacts of the restriction would vary depending on whether or not the concentration limit was changed or whether or not the duration of the different transitional periods were changed. When committees evaluate proposals, they consider these sorts of differences in what's called a sensitivity analysis to understand how changes to the proposal may change the impacts. And when I talk about impacts, what I mean here is the costs and the benefits to society as a whole. These can include the manufacturers of the lead ammunition. It can include impacts on the manufacturers of alternatives ammunition, but also impacts on the environment as a whole, and specifically on human health as well. So the benefits of the restriction on human health, but also the benefits of the restriction on some of the environmental receptors which have been identified. How would these change with different transitional periods? Question 13. This is a simple question and it's to do with monitoring of environmental exposure. The committees here are interested in information on organisations in Europe that are regularly monitoring the impacts to wildlife and the environment from use of lead ammunition and lead fishing tackle, and specifically with ongoing programs that are in place to monitor these impacts, and programs that could stretch into the future that may be useful to monitor the effectiveness of the proposed restriction. Question 14, and this is the final specific information request. This relates to a practice which we call voluntary military training. The Annex 15 report describes the practice of voluntary military training that is reported to take place in some EEA countries. And this is training that takes place outside of a normal military hierarchy, but is done in order to maintain preparedness of ex-military staff. should they be required. And the specific information here is to provide further information on this voluntary military training practice, in which member states is it happening, including a justification for why lead ammunition is required in this training, and equally why a specific derogation for this activity is needed beyond the existing proposed scope and derogations, which clearly already exclude military activities from the scope of the restriction. So that concludes my introduction to the specific information requests. I'll now tell you what will happen to your comments after you've made them. At regular intervals during the consultation period, on around a monthly basis, we will publish all of the non-confidential comments on our website so that you can see what other people are submitting to the consultation. At the same time, they will be scrutinised by the dossier submitter, this is ECHA of course in our place, but also by the Risk Assessment Committee and the Socio-Economic Analysis Committee. And where comments contain relevant and substantiated information, they will be addressed either in the background document or in the RAC or the SAEC opinions. It's important to note that the dossier submitter and the RAC and the SAEC do provide a response to all of the comments which are submitted, and these responses are published on the ECHA website at the end of the process. So a comment can be reflected in the background document, it can be reflected in the RAC-SAEC opinion, or it may only be reflected in this response to comments that's published at the end. So finally, I'll conclude with some step-by-step guidance on where to find the consultation and how to access it and how to submit your information. So the place to start is the website. We can only accept comments which are submitted through the ECHA website through the consultation web forms. Please don't submit information via email. They won't be considered. They have to come through this web form. To find the web form, you can use the web address that you see here on the screen. And then when you click on the link that takes you to the submitted restrictions under consideration, you'll find the specific entry for lead and its compounds, and then you need to click on the button at the right hand side that's labelled Details. This will then bring you to the specific page for this consultation that includes all of the background information. It also includes a summary of the proposal in all EU languages, and it gives the deadlines for the end of the consultation, which is the 24th of September 2021. We can only consider comments submitted before this deadline. There is also an earlier deadline given as well of the 5th of May 2021. This is not a binding or mandatory deadline, but any information that is submitted by the 5th of May will be able to be considered at the first meeting of the RAC and the SAEC where they consider their opinions. It's possible to make multiple submissions to the consultation. So if you want to submit early comments that maybe respond to some elements, but then maybe describe how you are going to submit subsequent comments, then please do that by the early deadline. It will be useful for the dossier submitter and also for the committees to know what sorts of information they're likely to get from stakeholders and at what point during the process, and they can build this in to their opinion making. Okay, finally, if you want to get to the web form, you need to click the link here that's called Give Comments, and that will then take you to the web form. There are various sections of the form. There are some for personal information, some for the organisation that you're submitting comments on behalf of, if this is what you're doing. Then there are sections for non-confidential comments, and these are split into the general comments, as I said at the start, anything that you wanted to respond to. And then there are blocks for the specific information requests, and you can submit information in text boxes for each of these questions. As well as these comments, it's possible to submit attachments, and there are two ways of submitting attachments. One is for a non-confidential attachment, and the second is for a confidential attachment. Please don't submit any confidential information in the text boxes in the fields itself in the web form, and these may also include company names. So if your company name is claimed as confidential, please don't include your company name in the responses in the text boxes, because it may inadvertently be published. And then finally, the submission of your comments. Unfortunately, it's not possible currently to save your submission. What we advise you to do is to prepare any your comments in advance and then to paste them into the web forms or attach them as attachments once you've already prepared them. And then when you've done this, click the Submit to ECHA button, and those comments will be sent to us. You'll receive a submission number via email. This is how you will know that your submission has been submitted successfully, and you should refer to this submission number if you contact us about your comments. Final point, it's not possible to retrieve your submission after you've made it. If you wish, you can take a screenshot or a printed copy before you submit it for your own references. Of course, when we publish comments on the website, you'll be able to see that your comment has been properly received and published, but this would only relate to any non-confidential elements of that comment. Okay, I hope that is useful, and we'll now move on to the concluding remarks. Thank you very much.
So now I'd just like to make some concluding remarks. Thank you to Christian and Pete for their parts of today's webinar. I hope you found that very useful. So to remind you, you need to send in your questions on the proposal using Slido, and the instructions on how to do that are on the screen again. Either go to slido.com, enter the event code, or scan the QR code below. And then to remind you, the material will be published following this online information session, and that includes the video recording, the presentations, and the Q&A we will produce. So it just remains now to thank you for your attention and to open the floor, open the Slido for taking questions and answers that will be answered by my colleagues. Thank you very much.